After weeks of chaotic leaks and U-turns, Rachel Reeves has finally revealed her budget plans. But only after the Office for Budget Responsibility published them first by mistake, prompting this early exchange at PMQs.
Does he have an explanation for this complete shambles?
We all know the biggest shambles in living history, the Liz Truss budget.
The Chancellor soon defended her tax rise after tax rise.
I have asked everyone to contribute, yes, for the security of our country and the brightness of its future.
Which inevitably prompted another backlash from the opposite benches.
That smorgasbord of misery we just heard from her can be summed up in one sentence. Labour are hiking taxes to pay for welfare.
So what's the strategy behind the tax rate?
If a Labour government stands for tax spend, that's precisely what the whole kind of strategy was supposed to avoid.
And could Rachel Reeves' delay tactics come back to haunt her?
I've never seen us in territory like this as a country. This is weird.
Welcome to Talking Politics. I'm Paul Brand.
And I'm Robert Peston.
And we're honoured to be joined here in the studio by Professor Jane Green. By day, the director of the Nuffield Politics Research Centre, but come every election night, one of our star analysts. So welcome to you, Jane. It's great to have you here. Thanks so much for coming in.
Thank you.
Right, now you and Robert have both been sharing your insight in our live budget programme, as Rachel Reeves confirmed what the OBR had already told us. And I want to start there, Robert, because that was pretty remarkable as mistakes go, wasn't it, for the OBR to upload all of their forecasts before the budget had even been delivered?
So a number of years ago, I was sitting in a studio just like this, but at what we might call a rival broadcaster for a budget programme. And there used to be a convention whereby, when newspapers were newspapers, the Evening Standard was briefed in advance about the main measures in the budget, but they weren't allowed to publish until the Chancellor had sat down and some bright young trainee put it all up before she'd stood up. So that's the last time I can remember sort of pre-publication. What's a non-obscene way of describing this kind of muck-up? But anyway, maybe it's a word that rhymes with muck. Maybe it's a word that rhymes. Anyway, but it is. I mean, but you could, for the Office for Budget Responsibility, which has. It handles sensitive data all the time. I mean, in the run-up to a budget, all the sort of government's secret plans are handed over to it. So you would assume that they're quite good at keeping stuff secure. Anyway, amazingly, before the Chancellor stood up, they published everything on their website.
Imagine that was you that did it,
sort of
Jane.
mind-boggling.
Imagine that was you that did it. It'd be so painful. You'd never live it down, would you? You'd never get over it.
I wanted to say a little prayer for the person that did it, because it's probably a really junior person that's just, hating themselves right now. But, I mean, more broadly, isn't this a kind of narrative control problem? I mean, there's a kind of, it's not the government's mistake, but it's just yet another moment where the government would like to set the agenda, set the narrative, take control of, show some leadership, have the kind of presentation of the budget being focused on Rachel Reeves. And surely, I mean, I'd assume that a fair bit of the chat around this over the next coming days is going to be that mistake. And the fact, obviously, coming off the back of everything being trailed just so incredibly, clearly for so long, and for it to just go on and on and on, it was almost a bit of the, icing on the cake in a bad way.
I thought it changed the dynamic a little bit of the budget as well, because often, there's sort of silence when the Chancellor first stands up, and for the first few minutes they get a period of grace, and then, of course, as ever, opposition benches start braying, etc., etc. But it was chaos from the start. I don't think I've seen a budget quite that loud right from the start, Robert.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It felt very odd. I mean, there I was sat in the ITV studio, and I couldn't work out, should I read the document? Should I, listen to the Chancellor? It was really messy. And it was, I'm afraid, of a piece with the most chaotic couple of months in the run-up to this budget. I mean, never known, a pre-budget period where so much was leaked including the biggest thing of all that we were expecting, which they then did a U-turn on
Yeah.
before the actual budget, which was they were planning to put up the basic rate of income tax. Then the forecast from the OBR turned out not to be quite as dire as they had feared. So Downing Street at that point basically put pressure on the Treasury to do the U-turn. I mean, there's been just so much chaos in the run-up to this budget.
On that point, as we knew before she told us, the Chancellor's headline announcement included lifting the two-child benefit cap and a new mansion tax for properties over £2 million, which is among tax rises which will raise £26 billion in total by 2030. That includes £8 billion from a freeze on tax thresholds and almost £5 billion on a tax on salary-sacrificed pension contributions. Here's a flavour of how Rachel Reeves announced those measures and Tory leader Kemi Badenoch's response.
I said there would be no return to austerity, and I meant it. This budget will maintain investment in our economy and in our National Health Service. I said I would cut the cost of living, and I meant it. This budget will bring down inflation and provide immediate relief for families. I said I would cut debt and borrowing, and I meant it. Because of this budget, borrowing will fall as a share of GDP in every year of this forecast. Our net financial debt will be lower at the end of the forecast than it is today, and I will more than double the headroom against our stability rule to £21.7 billion, meeting our stability rule and meeting it a year early.
She has chosen to put up tax after tax after tax, taxes on workers, taxes on savers, taxes on pensioners, taxes on investors, taxes on homes, holidays, cars, I think even milkshakes, taxes on anyone doing the right thing. She and this government have lost what little credibility they had left, and no one will ever trust her again.
I actually thought that was Kemi Badenoch's best performance, arguably, in the Commons. Some people thought maybe she was a bit too personal about Rachel Reeves. I saw on Twitter, for example, they're accusing her of being a little bit bullying and almost humiliating Rachel Reeves by making lots of personal comments. But nonetheless, plenty of politics to go at here, Jane.
Yeah.
What did you make of the political strategy of this budget? Because you've been focusing a lot on how voters feel, particularly in terms of their pockets and how they feel economically and how inclined they are to vote Labour over other parties. What did you make of the kind of strategy here?
Yeah, so since the election, when Labour came into power on a really small vote share, 34%, with this huge majority, they've lost about half of that support. And now, why have they lost it? Well, they've lost it primarily because people feel economically insecure. They're worried about their finances, and we see that very clearly in our research. And then, once that's happened, once people feel aggrieved and disillusioned and fed up, they're then looking to the party that's closest to them on other issues such as immigration. But that's the kind of sequence of how, that's the process of how that's happening. Now, the government has clearly been, in my, from my perspective, quite confused about what they need to do, because clearly they need to get back up to 34% or more, but, they're in the doldrums, and so are the Conservatives, and frankly, we've got now this kind of 5-6 party kind of contestation, huge fragmentation. So they've been kind of, I think, caught between, do we just promise economic growth in a bit and people can wait and it's going to be hard? I mean, that was the mood music to begin with, wasn't it? It was like, look, you're just going to have to give us some time. It's going to be difficult. If you thought there was going to be a quick fix, it isn't coming. And I think what they've realised is that that isn't going to work and that they need to do something far quicker. And I think they're right about this, they need to prioritise economics. They need to prioritise the cost of living crisis, how people feel, their worries around the economy. And frankly, they're losing votes right across the political spectrum on the economy, whereas prioritising a small slither of votes that they're losing to reform on, say, the issue of immigration,
which has
been
a
costing
lot of their
them.
announcements.
It has dominated so much of politics. And, the other problem, and we saw this with the winter fuel U-turn cut and with disability benefits, is I think, people just looking and thinking, well, what is the Labour government for then? If it's not for helping lift people out of poverty, if it's not for protecting the most vulnerable, and hence I think, they just just had to lift the two-child limit, because Labour MPs, and of course there's a lot of Labour MPs, lots of new Labour MPs, wanting to give their, constituents something that actually, this is Labour. Yeah. And I think, it was very much a return. I will see if it's a return. We'll see if it's going to last. I mean, frankly, I don't know about you, Robert, but, I'm not in the, I've stopped quite a long time ago thinking that something's going to be a permanent shift, because there is so much kind of almost overreaction to short-term kind of opinion poll chasing. And actually, it's a much bigger picture here. It's, what do you stand for? Are you competent? What are your values? Do you stand for people like me? And, but I think ultimately they've recognised, which, our research has shown over the last year, is that their biggest problem is actually losing votes on the left and to undecided. And it's the economy.
Yeah. And I thought that was interesting, actually, picking up on what Jane said, Robert. Kind of asserting the Labour values of this budget. Rachel Reeves, I mean, all chancellors do, I guess, to some extent, but Rachel Reeves seemed at pains to point out, for example, that she came into government to help children in schools. She talked a lot about her school. She talked about lifting the cap rather on two-child benefits, which she said was, a key Labour policy, etc., etc. It did feel like, she had one eye on the backbenchers, but also maybe one eye on defining what Labour stands for at a time when they are accused of not really communicating that very well.
So, lots of budgets I've lost count the number of budgets that I've had to analyse and, for programmes like this podcast. And they're often a bit messy. And actually the number of budgets where there's a very, very clear story, I suppose in my lifetime I can't remember that many, but this is a government that has struggled to tell its own story, to give people a sense definitely. Of, what it is, what it wants to achieve, where it's going. This budget was a moment where she could have shaped it in a way that was easy for, Keir Starmer and the other ministers to talk about and sell. I don't think, however, she pulled that off really, because it's a sort of a bit of a ragbag of different stuff. There's a modest amount of money, only 400 million a year, being taken from those who live in properties valued at more than £2 million. Won't happen for 2 or 3 years. I suspect that's going to be quite complicated to actually put into practice, because they've got to do a valuation, which will not be easy. The last time houses were valued in this country on a sort of national basis was 1991, believe it or not. So there's quite a lot of difficult work to be done there. But then on the other hand, this freezing of thresholds at which people pay the different rates of tax, that will mean that quite a lot of people on low incomes who don't currently pay income tax at all will pay income tax. Quite a lot of people who do not think of themselves, senior nurses, senior teachers, who don't think of themselves as on big incomes, will find themselves paying the 40 pence high rate of tax. So quite a lot of their people, as it were, are being made worse off by this budget. Obviously in terms of her, one of the things I said on, our live programme about all of this, there was a big element of all of this, which was, save Keir Starmer, save Rachel Reeves from a sort of coup by the parliamentary party to get them out. And that's what, abolishing, frankly, the two-child limit was primarily aimed at. It's what Labour MPs were desperate to achieve. And it is a credible if you talk to various think tanks who know most about this, they say it's probably the most cost-effective way in the short term of lifting quite large numbers of people out of poverty. So it is a genuinely credible anti-poverty measure. On the other hand, it's also perfectly clear there are not many votes to be won on this, because it is genuinely, there are quite a lot of British people who think over a certain limit you shouldn't have children if the state's going to pay for those children. And one of the reasons why actually initially Keir Starmer was slightly kicking and screaming not to do this is because his chief advisor or his chief of staff, a chap called Morgan McSweeney, was absolutely persuaded that going down this route would lose them votes, particularly in the red wall that he's desperate to win support back. Now,
does that show the strength of the backbenches?
Sorry?
Does that show the strength of the backbenches at the moment?
Well, it just shows that he's got, that his first priority is to unite his party, which was desperately disunited. And, I suspect he has achieved that. But, this question of what the big story to sell the country is, I'm not sure. And I'd like to just go back to something I talked about at the top of the programme, which is the fact that they had planned to raise the basic rate of income tax. Now, they were terrified of doing it because it, or at least in Downing Street, they were terrified of doing it. I think Rachel Reeves had broadly made up her mind to do it. But in Downing Street, they were terrified of doing it because they thought that it would be the backlash from breaking a manifesto commitment, a very clear manifesto commitment, would be too great, and they weren't sure that they could recover the position by the time of the election. There is a counter-argument, which I think in the end was one that Rachel Reeves understood and was prepared to go with, which is if she had put up the basic rate of income tax, done this switcheroo simultaneously, cutting national insurance by the equivalent amount, 2 percentage points, it would have had two really quite big positive impacts for the government. One is I'm absolutely certain, because I've talked to a lot of these people who manage vast amounts of money and lend to the government, that actually it would have led to a very big bounce in the price of government bonds, the price of gilts, which would have meant that the amount that the government pays to borrow would have fallen very sharply. And the reason it would have led to that bounce is because the government, Starmer and Reeves, would have signalled that they were prepared to take genuinely very tough decisions to get the debt down. At that point, I do genuinely think a lot of money would have come back into the UK and a lot of money would have been lent to the government. And with those interest rates coming down, actually that frees up for that, quite a lot of resource for them to do other things in terms of public spending and down the track, even think about cutting taxes.
As Rachel Reeves said today, £1 in every 10 of government spending is going on servicing the debt.
But they didn't have the guts to do that, so they have lost that. It is, gilt prices have risen a tiny amount, but a tiny amount, right? Not enough to, really reduce the cost of borrowing for the government very significantly. The other thing, which actually was I don't think actually Downing Street quite worked out, but the other tremendous advantage for them of doing this switch, putting up the basic rate of income tax, cutting national insurance, is that would have been a bung to voters in Scotland because actually they don't have the ability to cut income tax in Scotland. That's a devolved that was devolved.
Insurance.
Sorry?
National insurance.
No. Broadly, national insurance is a national thing or a UK thing. So they would have cut national insurance for the whole of the UK. Right, which would have been a bung to Scottish voters, as it were, and then there would have been a challenge to, essentially the Scottish, but the 2 pence would not have gone on, the wage packets of Scottish voters, and ahead of an election in 2026 that. Labour currently looks set to lose very badly in Scotland. That would have been really quite an attractive bribe for Scottish voters.
One of the things I find really, really tricky right now, right, with kind of our political moment, and I'm somebody who studies, my entire job, right, is to study and understand public opinion and the kind of political consequences of politicians and governments doing different things. And yet there's just I almost start to feel like there's too many paralysing choices here, right? So, do you help your voters in Scotland? Do you signal your values? Do you do a U-turn or not do a U-turn? Do you try to wait for economic growth because that's the most important thing? Do you actually offer something to these voters? I think it's almost just missing a really critical point, which is leadership. And I know it's really easy for me to say, but, we're in a moment where, frankly, you're going to lose some, win some, rocks hard places, and I felt like that was so kind of epitomised that moment on the income tax decision, was that, which you pick your poison. Essentially, you're going to lose votes, you're losing tons of votes, you're losing more votes in the first year of a parliament than ever before for a government. You're in a historically unpopular situation, and you won your majority on the basis of an incredibly thin vote share, right? So which poison are you going to go for? Because there's going to be...
And on your point, voters aren't stupid, right?
No.
I mean, they may think at least the basic rate of income tax is going up, but they will also know, many of them, that their tax rates are going up because she's freezing thresholds. They know that that is going to hurt them really quite significantly.
And they're going to hear that over and over and over and over again, even though what she was trying to do, I think, in the budget was defer a lot of the pain and give some kind of short-term goodies, right? So the £150 on energy bills relief is next year, after the winter, I did notice, but nevertheless next year. Whereas the tax threshold kicks in several years down the track, where we might be in another general election.
And actually, to add to that, this was one of the most... I've not come across this before in any budget, but it's not just the freezing of the tax thresholds has been... is a deferred tax increase, which it is a massively deferred tax increase because it's 3 years after these ones expire in 27, 28. But the all of the tax raises are massively backloaded. So I've just got the numbers here. So the first time, as a result of what she's announced today, there's a significant increase in taxes. It's 2028-29, where they go up by 11 billion. And then the following year, they go up by a further 23 billion pounds. Now, normally chancellors, and the only reason she hits these fiscal rules is because of those deferred tax rises. Now, normally chancellors do something which most of us regard as totally dishonest, is they hit their fiscal rules. Jeremy Hunt did this, for example. They hit their fiscal rules by promising to freeze public spending or cut public spending. Not tomorrow, not next year, but 3 or 4 years hence. And those cuts almost never materialise. The reason nobody ever actually manages to reduce the debt in this country is because people promise to be honest and prudent in a few, but then when it comes to it, they won't make the cuts.
This is on tax then. Do you think she might not increase tax when it comes to it?
But that is
just before the election.
But that is the question that I am basically raising, which is this is the equivalent of a dishonest promise to cut spending. She is saying, that tax rises tomorrow. But do we actually believe that literally weeks before a general election, Labour can sustainably go into a general election with taxes set to go up by 23-24 billion pounds? This is a sort of... I've never seen us in territory like this as a country. This is weird.
It is interesting, Jane.
No, I mean, just it feels very kind of reminiscent of various different things. It's almost like, essentially, she's kind of created a problem that is... people are going to think their taxes are going up, but they might not. And actually, you really don't want to be in that situation where you're losing support because people think that you're a tax spend party. I mean, this for me was very much, within incredibly tight margins, a real kind of Labour budget, right? So if I suspect that when we look at the papers tomorrow and the coverage after the event, is that this is going to be a tax spend budget.
Yeah.
And there isn't very much promise of growth. And actually, if you're a Labour government and you're taxing, and this is why Kemi Badenoch was saying tax.
She's defined it well.
It feeds in, doesn't it?
That's what defines it in the absence of a better narrative.
So it feeds into that stereotype. So people look at this and say, okay, well, perhaps, the child limit, perhaps you care about poverty and the vulnerable. Well, at least that's something, that tells us a little bit about what a Labour government stands for. But if a Labour government stands for tax spend, that's precisely what the whole kind of strategy was supposed to avoid, and they're going to feed into it. So that, essentially they're just going to potentially worry people about these tax rises and, like you say, not actually do them.
Can I ask you as well about the disparity between generations?
Yeah.
Because I was really interested that on my school parents WhatsApp group, there was a text that pinged up that got a lot of likes on the group, which was this: another example of the government being held hostage by boomers. That was what their analysis of the budget was. So I think what they're talking about is, for example, the fact that this new rule around ISAs and how much you can save doesn't apply to pensioners. The fact that state pension is going to go up more than wages have gone up in some cases.
Yeah.
The mansion tax, I think, if we're going to call it a mansion tax, the tax on 2 million plus homes, I think can be deferred, right? There was talk of that anyway in the run-up to the budget. We probably have to delve into the detail. They can defer it until after you've died.
Saying if you can't, they're basically saying if you happen to have a relatively low income, look, there are parts of London like Notting Hill, right? If you bought a house in Notting Hill 30 years ago, lucky you, because you're now sitting in a house that's probably worth somewhere over 10 million quid. But some of the people sitting in these houses, are not wealthy people. They don't have high earnings,
pensions, for example.
There might be pensions, but some of them, So Notting Hill is an area that's changed so much over the last 30 years. And this is not a government that wants to basically force people to sell their homes if they can't pay the additional tax.
So they get to defer until after they die.
Either they defer it, either they sell the house or they die, basically.
So then their children might end up paying it, for example, out of the lump of their inheritance. So I guess that the heart of this text that pinged on the WhatsApp group is it, again, the working generation, the working age people who are paying everything for, some would argue, not me, some would argue, for boomers to have quite a nice standard of living, a better standard of living in some cases than working people have.
And pensioner poverty was the one category of poverty that went down the most under the previous Labour government before the Tories, right? So this used to be a historic, massive problem, and it isn't as big a problem now. Clearly, there are some pensioners who are very vulnerable. The majority are not. So in surveys, we ask people about their financial worries, right? The peak group who are most worried about their finances is the midlife group.
Wow.
And so the younger people, they're often on low incomes but have prospects and hopes and ambitions for the future and hoping it's all going to work. Maybe they have the bank of mum and dad. It's harder for younger generations than it used to be, but it's nevertheless relatively okay in the age distribution. And then pensioners who are on low incomes, of course, that your low income doesn't tell about your, £1.5 million house. It isn't going to be now touched. And by the way, most of our pensioners don't live in cities where the price of housing is so much higher. Yeah. So there'll be fewer pensioners falling into that 2 million, there'll be more falling into the below £2 million threshold who own their homes and have seen huge asset appreciation, geographically speaking. But the group who experience and tell us they've experienced the greatest peak of financial worries are those aged between 35 and 59. Why is that? Because they might have reasonable incomes, or you'd think on the face of it, if you just look at people's incomes, well, then they'll be fine. And it's not a traditional low-income group. But actually the outgoings and the stresses and the pressures and the difficulties of making ends meet are peaking for that group in society now. So it's the midlife group, and this group is also the most volatile in their electoral preferences because they don't feel as represented. Younger people look at the Greens and maybe Labour historically to represent them. Older voters are still sticking with the Tories, although that average age is getting higher and higher and higher. So it's the midlife group who don't feel represented, don't feel catered to, are having the most acute financial difficulties, and indeed are leaving Labour in higher numbers too, and it's no wonder really.
And we all know the political reality of that, right, Robert, is obviously older people vote more and it's just politically impossible to, for example, scrap the triple lock. But I just wonder how sustainable...
Can I just say something?
Go on, Jane, yeah.
I mean, if you don't mind, but it's politically unsustainable to do all the things that have happened. What I don't understand about this is that why is the triple lock so much more important than all the other reasons Labour's losing so much support, right? So why would you want to kind of why would you only care about the electoral support of one group? It doesn't make sense.
This is what my question was going to be, is how sustainable is this longer term? Because, Robert, you tweeted about the overall welfare bill going up to something like 400 billion, I think, by the end of the Parliament? Or
so I'll dig out the numbers again. So,
and a massive chunk of it is pensions.
Yeah, it is a massive chunk of that is pensions. So I'll tell you how much of that is pensions. So over the next 5 years, according to the OBR forecast, welfare spending will rise by £73.2 billion to £406.2 billion. Now, most of the recent fractious and difficult debate for the government in all of that has been what to do about the disability benefits element of all of that. And, they were hoping to reduce that growth by what, frankly, in the scale of 73.2 billion is a relatively paltry £5 billion. But, their MPs wouldn't let Rachel Reeves get away on that. There was a rebellion, and that there's now a review going on to see how they can claw some of that back. But that reform was thrown out. But just to be clear, in that rise of 73.2 billion, there's a 20 billion, which is a significant rise in disability benefits, but the rise in pensioner spending, which not all of that is the triple lock, some of it's housing benefits, some of it's pensioner credit, but the rise in pensioner spending is £34 billion. Wow. It's significantly greater than the disability element. And when you have private conversations with senior politicians of all parties, they all say it's not, the rise in pensioner spending is not sustainable, right? And actually, if you look at the sort of long-term work that the OBR has done, broadly, the OBR forecasts that in 30 years, if we don't get a grip on the triple lock and pensioner spending, we're bust as a nation, because because as the working population falls, as people live longer, as the pressures on the health service also rise, the cost of essentially the pensioner population becomes genuinely unsustainable. So they are going to have to get a grip on this.
Who's going to touch that politically? Because Reform UK probably wouldn't go into the next election, would they?
If there was any...
The Greens, maybe?
But if there was any party that could have been able to do it, it would have been Labour, ironically, right? So, and just to sort of step back a moment as well and think, OK, we're making the assumption, right, that somehow older voters are more important electorally, not more important on average, but just electorally, right? That they vote more in high, they vote in higher numbers. These are relatively recent things. They don't have to be the case, right?
It hasn't always been the case.
It hasn't always been the case. Okay. It's quite it's been the case in the 2000s,
right?
And it certainly hasn't been the case until recent elections that there was a very pronounced age divide in electoral preferences, right? So this is very much a kind of post-Brexit phenomenon. Fascinating reasons for that. Just finished a book talking about it. So, we don't have that kind of time. But, this age divide is very new. And so...
Well, it's always been a bit of an age divide because people have tended to move to the right as they've got older. But I agree it's much more stark than it's ever been.
Yeah, it's much more stark. And so the Labour Party in 2017 had the majority of its support amongst younger voters. The Labour Party in 2019 had the majority of its support amongst younger voters. The left parties in 2024 had the majority of their support among younger voters. And why I say that is because we were in a very high fragmentation, lots of votes for the Greens, the Lib Dems and the Nationalists in 2024. And so that left bloc is still a younger bloc. And so if you're ever going to get a government that was going to actually, for electoral reasons, if not for moral reasons and everything else, we're going to try to tackle this issue of inequalities in wealth across the age distribution, intergenerational wealth inequalities, it could have been the Labour government.
But also the intriguing thing about Labour is not only are they sort of frightened of seizing or capitalising on the reality of the younger distribution of their vote, they are also a party that still thinks it is possible and really matters to get back the white, red wall, slightly older voters.
Yeah.
And they, one of the things we've been watching them do, and I think some of this was done, will have reinforced that, is they are so dependent on university-educated young voters, particularly in London, and so much of what they do actually alienates those people. Now, there is a risk, for example, with this mansion tax, right? Now, it is broadly the case that those young university-educated voters will not own, many of them, £2 million plus properties. But if this policy depresses the London housing market quite significantly, which it could do...
Makes houses more affordable for people.
Well, it makes the houses more affordable but not if you are one of the many people over the last few years who bought a house that you could barely afford when interest rates were 0%, and now you're absolutely struggling to pay an enormous mortgage. There is a genuine risk with what's happened, that if all property prices are crushed by what they've announced, that actually you could see quite a lot of these people who would be Labour supporters seeing the value of their houses fall below the value of their mortgages.
I've got to disagree. I mean, I'm not disagreeing that could happen, but I'm disagreeing that would be electorally damaging for Labour. So if you want to do one thing for that midlife group, those working adults...
Negative equity would be disastrous.
Negative equity is
for
disastrous.
anybody who's in power.
But if house prices fell, that would be the single most important thing that would enable that midlife group of working adults and families in this country to get by, and it would help younger generations to get onto the housing ladder. So if you think, so absolutely...
But not as a shock. The problem is, I completely agree with you that if you could manage the fall in house prices in that kind of way, of course it would be massively beneficial to whichever government achieved that. What is never beneficial to governments is a shock, right? A shock that basically means that large numbers of people are terrified of losing their homes.
And then how many people live in 2 million plus houses outside of London?
But that's not the point I'm making. I'm making if it depresses the whole market, which it could do, which it could.
Well, sometimes the market. Sometimes the market does behave very differently in London at the top end, and it can be a bit of a bubble in London.
If all that happens is you get essentially a two-tier market, right, and it's only the top end that suffers, great. Right,
and then that's to Jane's point that could actually help electorally.
Yeah, that would help.
That would be great. But who knows what's going to happen?
Who knows? Absolutely.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll wait and see what happens. If only we had a crystal ball. That's it for now. Thanks so much to both of you. Thanks, Jane, again, for being a guest on the podcast too. Come back again soon, won't you? And thanks to you too, whether you've been watching or listening. If you haven't already, do subscribe on YouTube or any podcast platform to make sure you never miss an episode. Until next time, it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me. Goodbye.